Call me, D.
Virginia sits at the top of the South and the bottom of the North. So for a long time, the city didn't have its own identity. We've heard stories from Baltimore, Atlanta, DC, and the list goes on. Most of our city's history is lost in graveyards or locked away in a prison. So I don't tell you these stories to glorify the street life. I want the youth of the day to understand who their fathers were, their mothers' fathers were. And we today are descendants of those stories. So if you're a Richmond native, this is what you come from. Because there's a time in history where the streets was saw as the only way out for us, to us. Especially when something has kept you fed, protected, warm, and alive. Because we all have an instinct to survive. And during these times, everything was about survival. Richmond at War, 1990.
My phone on D&D, don't wanna talk unless you got some cheese for me. These hoes get pleasure out of pleasing. Ain't cuffing no white bitch, they ain't got no seasoning. Niggas just talking to talk, there's no logical reasoning. Hold on, I'm giving this shit all I got. How the fuck could I not be a beast with it? Don't got that pink slip, that's how I know that you easy.
As you already know, here on this channel, we don't cover anything in the realm of politics. I'll leave that to those who are well versed in those subjects. And I want to show you how easy state politics can find its way to the streets. So to kick it off, I want to introduce you to a man named Keith Robinson, or also known as Keith Kemp. Now, we have little to no information on who this man was as a child, what home was like, or the man's character in general. But what we do know is that at some point, he would move to Richmond, Virginia. He was born the year 1971 in the great state of New York, the concrete jungle as they like to call it. By the time he turns 18 years old in 1989, he's living in Los Angeles, California. During his time on the West Coast, Keith would find himself in a fatal altercation where he would ultimately stab a man to death in an apparent case of self-defense. This would all take place in the city of Victorville, California, where he was convicted of voluntary manslaughter. So this could have been anything from a situation that went too far or something or someone pushing him past the point of losing control. The California Department of Corrections would take custody of Keith in October of '89. And after 3.5 years behind bars, he was paroled in October of '93, then returned to Virginia. California authorities suggested to the parole officers here in Richmond that Keith be released under supervision, which would go on for another 3 years. And while here, he eventually moves in with his mother, Bernice Kemp, on the 2400 block of North Avenue. But the change in scenery wouldn't make a bit of a difference, because in January of 1996, Keith Robinson was convicted of misdemeanor assault and sentenced to a month in jail. Then a month after, he was sentenced to an additional 3 months in jail on a second misdemeanor assault case. Cases we have no known details for. Now for the rest of the year 1996, Keith flies below the radar, and by the time we hit the month of October, he's officially released from supervision. So moving on to 1997, we now introduce you to a man named Herold Marsh.
I've been literally 6 feet away from a person that got shot in a drive-by when I was buying crack on the south side of Richmond. A kid got shot in the neck and in the hip. I've seen people robbed, seen people completely lose their whole family out here. My mom ended up getting murdered. She was getting high while she ended up getting murdered at a party.
So who is Herold Marsh? By this time, he's a 59-year-old lawyer from Richmond who just 7 years prior became a substitute judge. In case you don't fully know what that means, Herold would take over if another judge wasn't available. He could take on small tasks like entering judgments, but final decision making was left up to the regular judges. Now, Herold was loved by everyone. To him, there was no task, whether that be sweeping floors or feeding the homeless, that was considered beneath him. The man literally spent majority of his life volunteering and helping people, with his presence and good deeds being felt throughout the entire small city of Richmond. Now, other than his wholesome deeds, he was also managing partner of the law firm Hill, Tucker & Marsh, a law firm that he would help build in the heart of Richmond's Jackson Ward district. So throughout his career, you could say he followed the footsteps of his older brother, Henry L. Marsh III, who back in 1977 became Richmond's first black mayor. In an unlucky draw, he'd have to deal with the most brutal of killers Richmond had to offer during that time, which were the Briley brothers, a story that I've previously covered on this channel. Now, in the years prior to 1997, it was Herold Marsh who held the day-to-day business together at the office downtown. This allowed his partners to have the luxury of more public affairs. So in doing this, he would meet Keith and his mother, Bernice Kemp. Now, we don't know exactly when they would meet. This could have happened years prior, or maybe a week, But the context of said meeting was to lease some property for a home daycare that his mother would actually run. So Bernice alone leased this house out on 4917 Warwick Road in south side of Richmond, and she leased it from a woman named Julia Tucker. This woman was the widow of Samuel Tucker, who was one of the founders of the law firm Hill, Tucker, and Marsh, the same law firm that Herold was a part of. Just to be sure y'all following me. Well, Herold, he handled this rental property for Miss Tucker. As we know, that's who he was, a man who volunteered himself in many ways. So it's settled. Keith's mother has the property and starts a home daycare service, and we'll call it Kings and Queens Daycare. But even with all this success surrounding Keith and his mother, Keith, for the life of himself, could not stay below the radar. Later that year, in the month of May, we're on the south side of Richmond, and it said that Keith allegedly fired shots at 2 people. The 2 people he was accused of shooting at were his own family members, which were cousins of his named April Kemp and Jermaine Brown. There's no known rhyme or reason. It just seemed that Keith had a real short fuse when it came to his anger. But this altercation was kept quiet for a few months, either by his family members or his ability to evade arrest. 2 months later, on the day of July 3rd, 1997, Keith's mother Bernice was accused of child endangerment and neglect. This was after an 18-month-old toddler, Rakavia Jackson, was left inside of a van amid the sweltering 96-degree heat that summer. Rakavia was the youngest of 12 children who were in the van when it returned from an outing at the Richmond Park. The older children jumped out of the van, and Bernice told an employee, Pansy Robinson, to bring Rakavia into the house. 2 hours passed before Bernice discovered that she wasn't in her crib and found the child unconscious in the van, while the van's windows had been rolled up. So the paramedics arrived, and she was treated for symptoms of a heat stroke at 2 local hospitals and then released a short time later. Now, Bernice's license was on the verge of being revoked after she was summoned to a court hearing that she never showed up for. And here comes a woman named Annette Jackson, which was the grandmother of the toddler, who said afterward, "I'm not in her shoes, but if it was me, I would definitely follow up and show some remorse." So as if things couldn't get any worse, she was also sent an eviction notice from Herold's firm because of past due payments on the property. Whether she received this notice before or after this situation is unknown. But on the day of July 22nd, Keith Robinson would pay Herold's firm a visit. Pulling up around 6:30 p.m. in a 1977 Cadillac Coupe de Ville, he was greeted by the front desk clerk, and she would say Keith seemed very angry as he searched for Herold. And soon after, she watched as Keith walked towards Herold's office, where she could see Herold himself gesturing for him to come in. The meeting was brief, and Keith would leave in the same angry manner. No word on the context of the meeting or what was said, but it's believed it was about the eviction notice of his mother's daycare home. The next day, on July 23rd of 97, it's around 2 p.m. and Herold was out like any regular day. He had been driving his Ford Escort that he was leasing at the time, on the way to his law office in Jackson Ward, coming from juvenile court in Chesterfield County. He would come up on a stoplight at the intersection of Hall Street and Jefferson Davis Highway. No soon after, does the same 1970s Cadillac Coupe de Ville that was parked at his office just the day before was pulling up alongside him. Before Herold could react, there were several shots fired through Herold's passenger side window, striking him in the torso area. And there he was, in broad daylight, on one of Southside's busiest intersections. A man from one of the city's prominent legal families had been executed, mob style. On this day, there had been several officers nearby on bicycles and some on feet, so the scene was crowded with police very quickly, but not fast enough, as Keith would still make his quick getaway. Detectives would clear the scene and forensics come in and search for evidence. While on the scene, one officer couldn't help but notice that infamous "Stop the Violence" mural painted on side a brick building. The message was clear, as it was ironic, because this mural was painted during the war on drugs era, back when Reagan was still in office.
I don't think anybody will miss the point. The thrill can kill. The drug dealers need to know that we want them out of our schools, neighborhoods, and our lives. And the only way to do that is to take the customers away from the product. Say no to drugs and say yes to life.
Still today, it seemed as if it set as another pretty decoration rather than a call of peace. About a week after Herold's death, on July 30th, the Hall Street Merchants Association sponsored a Stop the Violence rally just up the street from where Herold Marsh was murdered. The rally was intended to help residents learn how they can get involved in public safety in their community. Then after, the city offered up a $25,000 reward for Herold's killer. The city officials then ramped up checkpoints for illegal guns and people in cars that may have been present during the murder. And this alone made it more than difficult for any big drug dealers or street guys to operate in the city at the time. Some guys were actually angry that somebody would do something that brazen to a guy that important, which slowed down drug distribution and got a few guys hemmed up for a good amount of time. And since the checkpoints were initiated, police seized 30 guns, over 300 grams of cocaine, 7.2 grams of heroin, and recovered or seized 20 automobiles. And the biggest bust to date came November 14th at a traffic stop with Henrico Police on Magnolia Street. A suspect carrying a firearm along with a half a pound of crack cocaine was stopped and arrested. By now, the shooting attack that Keith had on his cousins will come back to bite him. He was arrested in the month of August, and his trial date was set for November 21st. So until then, Keith would be in jail with a $100,000 bond for his 2 attempted murders, but he caught a break because those charges were withdrawn after a statement from one of the victims, Jermaine Brown, would say, and I quote, "April was having an argument with the guy in another car when he fired shots. I don't know the guy, but I do know Keith Robinson, and this was not him." So with no further evidence to go on, the charges were dropped. Now at this time, Keith knows that the police suspects him of Herold's murder. It was too much evidence to go on. He tried high and low, far and wide to bond out and possibly flee the city, but not long after, before he could even think about bonding out of jail, he was indicted for the murder of Herold Marsh. There were very few witnesses to come forward, but the ones who did were a white couple inside of a red pickup truck who were not only at the scene when it happened, but was directly behind Keith as he sent shots through Herold's car. That alone was all the jury needed to convict. But this being the days of police brutality and a corrupt legal system, the jurors wanted to be sure that they were convicting the right man. So they would lay out the evidence to jurors which showed motive, time frames, and locations. One piece of evidence that stuck out the most would be the same colored and model Cadillac being at the law office a day before Herold was killed and being seen leaving the scene on the day of his murder itself. So he was ultimately convicted the following year in 1998 and sentenced to 53 years in prison. And asked for his mother Bernice Kemp, her license was completely revoked a week after his sentence, being charged of felony child neglect. Herold, he will be remembered as a sharp legal mind, a tireless servant of his church, and a generous mentor to Richmond's young people. And he was a lot of things to a lot of people in the city, and not one negative word can be said about him. And to shed light on his older brother, Henry Marsh III, who had just recently passed in January of this year, almost a decade after Herold's death in '97, he would resign from his seat in 2014. He stayed inside the political realm and went on to represent the 16th District. Virginia Senate Democrats called Henry Marsh III an extraordinary individual who dedicated his life to the pursuit of justice, equality, and a service to his community. Now, I've had this story on my list for a while now, and with the passing of Henry Marsh III and today's political show, I figured why not. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I've been hearing about this story for years. The judge who was murdered mob style on a busy city intersection in broad daylight. But I want to give you the perspective of those who weren't necessarily there, but they were around at the time. So yes, I have another segment of street theories for y'all today, but this time it's only one. And the story goes is that Herold Marsh was to be the judge presiding over a case against an individual from Blackwell, specifically from the Blackwell Top Boy faction. And those group of guys have a story all in its own, so we won't touch too much on them today. But that was the word from several guys who were outside. Allegedly, it was an effort to either derail the case, slow it down, push the date back, or in a mafia mob-style manner, scare the DA and prosecutors to drop the case as a whole. But as you just heard, you got the actual facts on why this judge was murdered. Now, maybe they're talking about a different judge at a different time, I'm not sure. But as I said before, that's all word of mouth and speculation. But if any of it were true, I don't think people understand what living under a Commonwealth state really meant. When any political figure is murdered in any manner in Virginia, the floodgates will open. The guy Travis Ball who killed a state trooper in 2015 was already caught, and still it ramped up aggressive investigations around the entire city. Needless to say, This was a case of a man who couldn't control his anger, and in turn got a slew of other people arrested in the process. Crazy how one man's actions causes several guys from that time to receive football numbers for whatever they were caught with, just because the tensions was high. Now the message I want to leave with y'all is this. In my most humble opinion, Herold Marsh and Henry Marsh were two important black men from our city that I feel demonstrated just how much of a choice we all really have, as far as leading a different life than the one that majority of us have always known. I've run through this story several times and I couldn't find a real reason for a generous, giving man like Herold to be killed in the way that he did. But I digress. In my eyes, I saw one successful black family trying to empower and help another less fortunate black family. It's a big reason they say our race of people are the only ones of mankind that refuses to help each other, hate on each other, constantly trying to outdo one another when we would all prosper if we worked as one. But we got years of scars and wounds that ain't healed, and I'm guilty of it myself too. I've said plenty of times that I'll tense up around a nigga in a mask before a white man with the same get up on. And yeah, we have our reasons for it, but for those of us who make it hard to trust us, are only hurting the ones who have to come after us. So with that, rest in peace to the fallen, and y'all stay safe out there.
Talk, no comment though, just paper chase. Chasing my dreams, my nightmares ain't got no money. Just a cardboard sign and they existing so bummy. And they want me down